Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this punny farewell bee set. I actually made this for my boss that was moving on to her next chapter in her life. And she loves bees and I love puns, so here we are. First up, I wanted to show you how I made the transfers. Royal icing transfers are a super helpful, really great technique to introduce yourself to in the world of royal icing. It means that you decorate royal icing images like this on something like food grade cellophane like I'm using here, or maybe parchment paper, and you allow the icing to completely dry, and then you just peel it off the surface that you piped it on, and then you can just kind of glue the transfers onto either a dry or a wet surface. And I'll talk later about the difference between putting it on dry or wet. And it's really great for a few different reasons. If you're going to be doing the same small little added shape over and over again in a set like this, like I use this little bee in most of the cookies that I did, it's just so much easier and so much faster and more consistent to just do a bunch at a time like this in kind of assembly line fashion. And it's also helpful, like on the beehive that I do later, I'm putting these bees onto an uneven surface, and it can just be harder to do that when piping directly onto the surface. So that's another great reason to use transfers. A lot of people also find that when they do transfers on food grade cellophane like this, that they don't get craters. Craters are when the center of the icing kind of caves in. Sometimes it's just like an indentation, but sometimes it can be as bad as like an actual hole in the surface. So I am using transfer sheets that I actually purchased from Etsy, and I will link them in the description of the video. They are from Maddie's Cookie Co. Maddie makes some really awesome transfer sheets because she uses them herself a lot for her own cookies, and I printed them out. And you do not want to actually pipe directly onto the paper. You want to make sure you're piping onto something that's food grade, but also you want to pipe onto a surface on top of the paper so that you can use those guides over and over again. And Maddie's great. She always provides several different size options. So I actually made 2 different size bees for the transfers. I will say that I'm kind of new to doing transfers. So these here, there are a few things that I would do differently and do better next time. One kind of, you could say, mistake I made is my icing is a little on the thin side. So the shapes settle out a bit more than I would like. And I particularly ran into this issue with these small bees because they ended up kind of spreading out a bit too much, so I couldn't use all of them because they flooded into each other. Whoops. But I would suggest using, if you can, a soft peak piping consistency. So really pushing the limits on how thick you can use, or at the very least, like a really thick flood, because that's going to hold the shape better. I know some people will actually do a 2 consistency outline and flood on transfers, but I can't even do that on a mini cookie, never mind a transfer. I don't think they would do it for these bees. I mean, these bees are the size of a dime, if that. The bigger bees I did were probably the size of maybe more like a quarter. I like to do 1 consistency for this for sure. But you can see here I am doing some wet on wet. So if you're doing a wet on wet, certainly your icing needs to be thin enough for that.
Thin,
so doing more like a thick
and they're
flood.
kind of spreading out too much. You can always only pipe every other image. I kind of made the mistake of piping every single one. Lesson learned. Next time I will probably do every other, unless I'm really confident in the consistency of my icing. It does take quite a while, I find, for transfers to dry. Typically, I mean, for me, I feel like that it takes overnight, and you really can't
take the transfers off before they're completely dry, because it really just doesn't work. It needs to be a completely dry surface when you're peeling it off. So if you can, start your cookies by making the transfers, or make them the night before if you can. Sometimes you may run into issues of the coloring if you have to remix your icing the next day. So I just made these transfers first. Then I decorated all the other cookies. I did put these in the dehydrator. I find that really helps to make them dry faster. Love my dehydrator. I will also link that in the description of the video. And I definitely made more bees than I needed. I also recommend that because depending on the design especially, it can be really easy for the bees or for any transfer, excuse me, to break when you're peeling it off or even applying the transfer to the surface. So just keep that in mind. So what felt like a bajillion transfers later, I finally had my little army of bees drying in the dehydrator. And so I started to work on my cookies. The first step here is the beehive, and I'm just doing a simple one consistency outline and flood, and I am flooding in sections. What that means is I'm alternating the sections that I'm flooding. I allow that to crust over. Crusting means it's just drying just enough on the surface so it's dry to the touch, and then flooding the alternating remaining sections so that there is definition in between the sections. You certainly could have, you could do a two consistency outline and flood here and actually outline all of the shapes first and then flood in from there. And that gives you a little bit more control of the shape, certainly. Part of me kind of wishes I had done that because my layers of my beehive get a little wonky later, but total personal preference here. I do think that my flood was a little on the thin side. You can see on those first sections that I flooded that they did crater just a bit. It's fine. We all survived, but just something to keep in mind, to think about here. And the color here of my yellow, I always do such weird mixes, but if I had to guess, it's a maricolor for sure, mostly egg yellow with a little bit of lemon yellow to kind of brighten it up. I like to place the transfers first like I did, just so I can get a sense of where they're going, and then I glue them on with piping consistency. You want to use just enough icing so it really adheres, but not so much that it's going to squish through. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this part of it. This really makes it so easy. So you can see that I'm putting these transfers across the sections, and it wouldn't have been impossible if I had piped that. Just like a little more challenging to make it all even. And here I am using that same piping consistency in a soft-ish, medium-ish peak, somewhere in there, to do this trail. And just piping lines, little lines in succession. If doing something free-handed like this kind of freaks you out, I would recommend using a scribe to kind of lightly trace out the design trail. You want to be a little careful with that because you might be able to see it if you dig too deeply. But there's the beehive. It's really simple, but it's so effective and so cute. So next up are the punny plaques that I did. That's punny with a P. And this first part, I'm doing this technique where you outline in a different color than you flood. And for me personally, I actually like to do the outline in flood consistency. I know, with like an actual flood tip opening. Like this yellow is what I used for actually flooding the beehive. And I like to use a flood consistency because I feel like it helps the outline to kind of be as prominent as possible. It spreads out more than
if you did a piping consistency, like you'd really have to use a pretty thick piping consistency to get as prominent of an outline as I did here with my flood consistency. It just seems like it shows through the best. Because sometimes when you do this technique, if you're not careful with how you're flooding, you can flood too close to the outline and then you can't really see the outline, and then it defeats the purpose of the design in the first place. So just something to keep in mind. I am going to be doing wet on wet here. So I wanted to kind of under flood to make sure I'm not using too much flood. Now, I did kind of regret how thick my white was. It was a bit too thick for my liking, but here we are. And I am using flood consistency with this yellow to pipe out these honeycombs. And I had to move pretty quickly here. This design kind of took me a while, and you'll see when I get towards the end that it does start to crust over. Oops. When doing a fine wet on wet design like this, I find that you have to that the opening of the bag needs to be pretty small. Because if you think about it, the flood consistency does spread out more than piping consistency. So you would need to cut your bag smaller than you would probably think to get the thickness that it ends up, if that makes sense. So I'm just completely eyeing this here, and I wanted all of my plaques to look different. I didn't want them to all have the same honeycomb design behind it. So I really tried my best every time to do something different. And I am actually going to show 2 of these plaques in this video so you can see me drum up another random assortment of these honeycombs. I really was just flying by the seat of my pants here, trying to figure out what would look good, what would fill the space well. And I had to tap, tap, tap again. You can see in the last honeycombs that I did that they're still kind of above the surface, and they're not going to settle on their own. So I need to use a scribe like I'm doing here. If you just kind of very lightly jiggle the surface of the icing, that will help the yellow settle into the white. It's not a perfect science here to do this, but it will certainly help a lot. I allow that surface to mostly dry, and now I'm doing the lettering, and I'm using a projector here. Love my projector. I have 2 different ones. I'll link them both in the description of the video. One's just a bit more affordable than the other, and the more expensive one has some more features that I like. And for the font here, I actually just downloaded a font from the internet, and I will link the font that I'm using in the description. And I just plug that font into Word, and I'm able to type out anything that I want. And the way that I do it with my projector is I take a screenshot of what I've typed out into Word. I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but it's the way I do it. And I take that screenshot, and then I use that as the file that I project from my iPad through the projector onto my cookie. I know, it's a lot of work. This here is pressure piping lettering. So I am increasing the amount of pressure on my downstroke and releasing it on my upstroke. I use a soft peak for my lettering. I would say on this day I was closer to a medium peak because the downstrokes are not really settling out on their own. If I wanted to be really particular, I could have used a scribe, but y'all ain't got time for that. This takes enough time. But anywhere from a soft to a medium peak will get you what you need. We'll get lettering that looks good, but more towards the soft peak will give you smoother letters. And here's an application of my little baby bee.
And again, I'm putting this onto a dry surface. Now, I mentioned earlier that sometimes you can put transfers onto a wet surface. That I tend to not like to do that because I have yet to do that technique that way without there being bleed through of the flood icing into the transfer itself. I know other people do it all the time and have no problems, so I don't know what it is. I know my icing is kind of unique in that I use lemon juice, so maybe that's it. I'm not really sure. But I feel safer doing it with dry icing underneath because you won't really know that it has bled through until it's well into drying, and then it's like it's hard to turn back from there. So just something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, I'm including, this is actually a different cookie from the one we just saw and a different pun. I just wanted you to be able to see another example. So it's all the same techniques over, but slightly different execution, different words. So I'm going to leave you here with this cookie and I'll be back when it's done.
And that is the second punny cookie. You will be missed. The other one was May the Force be with you. Haha. Like I said, I like puns. So here we are with the bee, and I am doing pressure piping here with a medium peak with a pretty big opening here. And pressure piping, what I mean here is I'm just applying a lot of pressure at the beginning of the stroke and then releasing that pressure as I'm pulling away. And I'm doing that same technique here with the little antenna. And this is a soft peak piping consistency that I'm doing here because I wanted a lot of poof. And if I used a thinner consistency, there is more likelihood that it would have cratered. So I didn't want that. But when you're using any sort of piping consistency, as like a flood, you do need to use a scribe to help it settle because it's not going to settle on its own. So I let that black crust over, going in with a yellow soft peak. And I really liked this particular design because the entire cookie is using piping consistency, which sometimes is just faster and easier. So I really liked that. That's the simple little bee. And then last up, we have this hexagon with lines on it, just because I wanted something kind of artistic and simple to go with everything that went with the color design. So here we are. This is a single consistency outline and flood. And I actually don't think anywhere in the set, oh no, just lied. I was going to say I didn't need piping consistency, but I just did that on the bee. So I did a single consistency here because it was just easy. And that's all I needed. And I will let that get a nice crust. And now I am piping lines. I personally love to pipe lines, but I gather a lot of people out there get really stressed out piping lines. A few things to kind of help you get some straight lines. First thing, it's really important to brace your arm on the table. I like to do it just above my elbow. You don't want to go too far up your arm because you need to have a good radius of movement in your arm for decorating. You can also brace your piping hand with your other hand if you need some additional steadiness of your hand. I personally don't like to do that, but a lot of people, even expert decorators, like to brace their piping hand with their other hand. So just something to keep in mind. And then the other really important thing is to lift your bag off the cookie. You can kind of see it when I'm piping here. Anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch when piping lines, super necessary. That's what is going to get your nice straight line with a nice flow. So that is my whole set. How did that go by so fast? I really had fun making this, really sweet, but with some humor. It's my kind of style. I hope you had fun watching this, and I hope you have fun making this yourself.